This show is made possible through underwriting support from the Bohannon Foundation.
Hi, this is Mike Casey for San Mateo County History Stories on Penn TV. And today I'm in Menlo Park at Fremont Park at the plaque commemorating the presence of Camp Fremont here from 1917 to 1919. Now, Camp Fremont was a training facility to train soldiers for entrance into World War I. Its boundaries were from the south, San Francisco Creek, on the south, as I said, where the Stanford Mall is now, to the north, Valparaiso Avenue. The eastern boundary was El Camino Real, to the west, on Alameda de las Pulgas. It covered over about 1,000 acres with over 1,000 buildings. That was the camp proper. Further to the west were thousands of acres of training facilities for field training. Some of that was in unincorporated Menlo Park. Some of it is on the land now where the Stanford Linear Accelerator Center is located. The population was 27,000 military personnel and 10,000 horses and mules. With that population, it easily dwarfed the number in surrounding communities, including Menlo Park, which at that time only had a population of 2,300. Now, the reason why the Army selected this area of San Mateo County is because of its close resemblance to the battlegrounds in France. In fact, there were a number of British and French officers here acting as advisors. Now, the presence of Camp Fremont here to Menlo Park was sort of a boon to the local residents. The property owners received lucrative leases for the Army using their land. The local contractors helped in the construction of the camp, and businesses did a brisk trade with the thousands of military personnel here. Also, Southern Pacific built a railroad spur to Menlo Park. El Camino was paved, and gas and water lines were put in that were later used for the community. Because of the short duration of America's participation in World War I, the life of Camp Fremont was also short in duration, as you can see here from 1917 to 1919. All in all, it is a very little-known chapter in San Mateo County history, which is all the more fitting because the post commander, Major General William Graves, and 5,000 men for the 8th Infantry that trained here took part in one of the little-known chapters of United States military history. In fact, it was so little known that it's not even mentioned on the plaque here. And San Mateans, that was the American Expeditionary Force Siberia. In other words, the U.S. invasion of Russia. Now, to understand how this event came to be, we have to know a little bit about World War I, the Russian Revolution, and the Russian Civil War. World War I, as the name implies, took place all over the world with a number of nations involved, but mainly the participants on the Allied side were Great Britain, France, Imperial Russia, and later, in the last year and a half of the war, the United States, against the Central Powers. The Central Powers included Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, which was really Turkey. World War I on the Western Front was characterized by a deadly stalemate of essentially 4 years, characterized by trench warfare where the front lines hardly changed from east to west over those years. On the Eastern Front, life was equally miserable and difficult. After 3 years in 1917, the Russian people were hungry, they were war-weary. There had been several, I should say also the Tsarist government of Nicholas II was also considered very corrupt and inept. There have been several attempts to overthrow the Tsarist government in 1905 before World War I, during World War I in February of 1917, and then again in October 1917, there was the Bolshevik Revolution against the Tsarist government. That was the one that had the most staying power. It wasn't a total revolution by 1917, but in March of 1918, the Bolsheviks had enough power to negotiate a separate peace with Germany. Now, that caused all kinds of alarm and anger on the Allied side. It would mean that Germany can turn all of their military might to the Western Front. It would mean more loss of lives for the Allies, more expenditure. In fact, by the spring of 1918, the Germans had seemingly broken through the stalemate and were only miles away from Paris. It was with all that in mind that in August of 1918, President Woodrow Wilson ordered Secretary of War Newton Baker to travel by rail to Kansas City to meet the post commander of Camp Fremont, Major General William Graves, who was taking the railroad in an easterly direction to Kansas City to meet and receive some unusual orders. Major General Graves thought for sure he was getting his commission to France. That was not the case. His orders were to reestablish the Eastern Front between Russia and Germany. To do that, he would have to guard the tons of supplies, I should say, that were lying on the docks of Vladivostok, Russia's only Pacific seaport. He was also to make sure that the Trans-Siberian Railroad stayed open. He was also to try to unite anti-Bolshevik Russians who were still willing to put up the fight against Germany with the Czech Legion. The Czech Legion were 70,000 strong. They were currently in Russia. They had been fighting for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They were subjects of that empire, and they were fighting reluctantly. They really desired their freedom from that empire. So when they had the chance, they were trying to reestablish that front also and fight against the Austro-Hungarians to try to win their freedom. Those were the directions that Secretary of War Baker gave to Major Graves. There was one other admonition: stay out of Russian internal affairs. As he put it, be careful, Major General, you are walking on eggs loaded with dynamite. Well, that was August 1918. With that, Major General Graves and the 5,000 men of the 8th Infantry of Camp Fremont made a 6,000-mile voyage across the Pacific, and they landed in Vladivostok, Siberia, in September 1918. Now, for you World War I historians, you know that in a couple of months, November 1918, the war was over. The armistice was signed. There was a reversal of fortunes on the Western Front, and the Allies were victorious. The joyous American doughboys, which was what American soldiers were called during World War I, returned from the Western Front in a sigh of relief. However, there were no such orders for the 8th Infantry in Siberia. December came, 1918. They still had not returned home. There were a number of senators that started questioning President Wilson. The war is over. Why are our troops still in Siberia? In fact, progressive Republican senator from California, Hiram Johnson, introduced a bill in the Senate to force President Wilson to state his policy. Why are these troops still in Siberia? That bill failed by one vote. So Wilson stayed mum. His Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, had no comments on it either. By mid-1919, there was a petition of 10,000 signatures from the family and friends of the soldiers still in Siberia asking President Wilson when their boys were coming home. They had patriotically given their boys to fight the Germans on the Western Front, and that was simply not the case. They were shipped over to Siberia, and they still hadn't returned home, even though the war was months over. Well, the real reason was, with the conclusion of World War I, President Wilson thought the most pressing international matter was the defeat of Bolshevism in Russia. Bolshevism would later be, we know it as communism in the Soviet Union. He was thinking of war-ravaged Europe that may be susceptible to the spread of communists to Western Europe. With that in mind, then, the defeat of Bolshevism, the American troops in Major Graves were now right in the middle of the Russian Civil War. The Russian Civil War, and I remember I told you the Bolsheviks' power or their revolution was not complete. Russia, by this time, 1919, had descended into a civil war, basically the Red Army, the Bolsheviks, the communists, versus the Whites. The Whites were a coalition of a number of other groups in Russia at the time. There were people that wanted to establish a democracy in Russia. There were moderate socialists that wanted to have a socialist type of society in Russia, but were not as extreme as the Bolsheviks. And there were out-and-out reactionaries, monarchists, people that wanted to return the Tsarist monarchy to Russia. And that was the coalition that the Americans had to deal with, and they were supplying the White Army during that time. However, that policy took a more difficult turn. Support for the White Army became more problematic for the Americans with the Alexander Kolchak coup d'etat. Kolchak was an out-and-out monarchist, and you were either a monarchist or a Bolshevik. There was no in between. He violently purged the white government. He executed anybody that was had ideas of a democratic society or moderate forms of socialism. He also raided villages to conscript forcibly any men of fighting age between the ages of 18 and 40. If villages heard that he was coming and they hid their men, he would execute any men over the age of 40. He would execute all the men in the village. So the Bolsheviks were guilty of their own atrocities before and after Siberia of 1919. But in that time frame, Alexander Kolchak and the White Army were the most hated and despised people by the Siberian peasants. And as fate would have it, they were being supported by the Americans, as the Bolsheviks were more than happy to point out, look, the Americans want to restore the Tsar. Some people say that Kolchak and his regime would not have survived one day without American support. Well, they did survive more than one day. They survived to the end of 1919. The Red Army finally defeated them, and that was the signal for the American troops to belatedly return home from Europe, from Russia. That evacuation took place from January of 1920 to April of 1920, long after Camp Fremont had been dismantled. Now, when the camp closed in 1919, a lot of the buildings were dismantled. Some were moved to the Presidio and Fort Mason in San Francisco. There still are some remnants of Camp Fremont in San Mateo and Palo Alto. For instance, the Oasis Beer Garden in Menlo Park, that was the old Camp YMCA. MacArthur's Restaurant in Palo Alto, that was the YWCA and acted as the hostess center during the camp's life here. By the way, that was designed and built by famed architect Julia Morgan. The camp hospital became the VA hospital in Menlo Park. And in the ensuing development of the land to the west, the occasional artillery shell was discovered. There were a number of sinkholes that were discovered in the development of this land, and that was left over from field training in which they simulated trench warfare. Well, that began a century of distrust and suspicion between Russia and the United States. Now, Russia and the communists certainly gave us enough pause to doubt their motives, to doubt their actions. But by virtue of America's invasion of Russia and 16-month occupation, that gave the Russians reason to suspect our behavior also. In 1987, ABC TV ran a miniseries, a 5-part miniseries entitled America, and that was America with the K. It was about the fictitious invasion of the United States by Russia and the subsequent occupation. Well, after the first installment, ABC News Bureau with ABC News with Peter Jennings got a phone call from the Russian ambassador, Yuri Dubinin. And he said, you know, this is a fictitious story. We've never invaded America, but you invaded us in 1918. Well, the News Bureau was dumbfounded. They had to scramble to do some research, and they finally came up with a professor in Louisiana, Professor Carl Richard, who had written about this invasion. And sure enough, the Russian ambassador was right. So, ladies and gentlemen, to the American audiences of the 1980s, the miniseries America about the fictitious invasion of Russia of the United States, well, that was a what if. But to the Russians, since 1918, their invasion of their country by America was a remember when. And that remember when included Major General William Graves and 5,000 men of the 8th Infantry of Camp Fremont, Menlo Park, San Mateo County. Now, this is a pretty complicated subject to cover, and I barely skimmed the surface. If you're interested in learning more about this event in American history, you can read this book by the professor I referred to already, Professor Carl Richard of the University of Louisiana, Lafayette, and his book, When the United States Invaded Russia. And this is Mike Casey, and I'll see you next time on San Mateo County History Stories.
This show is made possible through underwriting support from the Bohannon Foundation.